You are standing on a dusty road in the Balkans, summer of 2014. The air hangs heavy with heat, sweat, and the unmistakable odor of unwashed bodies. In the distance, a sound reaches you, not triumphant war drums, not cheers of victory. You hear moans, thousands of voices, crying in confusion and agony. And then you see them, an army of 15,000 men, but they are not marching in formation. They stumble forward, shuffling in a grotesque parade of human suffering. Every 99 men are completely blind, their eye sockets hollow, crusted with dried blood. Each group is led by a single man who retains one eye, forced to witness the horror he guides home. This is psychological warfare elevated to an art form. This is vengeance perfected. This is the product of two emperors whose hatred burns so deep that the battlefield itself becomes a stage for personal vendetta. And the truly horrifying part? When the procession finally reached their king, the scene was so devastating that he died of shock just 2 days later. How does hatred reach a point where blinding 15,000 men seems like justice? Today, we explore one of history's most calculated acts of cruelty, the story of Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer, and the revenge that left an empire reeling. To understand this act of systematic horror, we must first understand the world that produced it. The year is the early 11th century, on the cusp of what we call the medieval period. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, still sees itself as Rome incarnate. To its people, it is no medieval kingdom. It is the Roman Empire, God's instrument on earth, the last bastion of true civilization. Constantinople, its capital, is the richest, most sophisticated city in the Christian world. While Western Europe remains fragmented and relatively primitive, Byzantium boasts Greek fire, advanced engineering, a professional standing army, and an administrative system that would make modern bureaucrats envious. Its libraries, universities, and cultural achievements will not be rivaled in the West for centuries. But empires are never content. Byzantium faces a critical problem. Bulgaria, the first Bulgarian empire, has spent decades resisting Byzantine expansion, slowly carving into its borders. Bulgarian territory stretches from the Danube to the Aegean Sea, from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. They are no barbarian horde. They have a sophisticated state, their own church, and most intolerably to the Byzantines, independence. Within Byzantine ideology exists a principle called Wane, the notion of a civilized Christian world under legitimate authority. To Byzantine thinkers, there can be only one true emperor, the legitimate heir of Rome. Everyone else is either a subject yet to realize it, or a rebel to be brought to heel. Samuel of Bulgaria clearly falls into the latter category. But this was not merely political theory. It was personal, deeply, violently personal. The story begins with two men whose hatred for each other would define 3 decades of warfare and create one of history's most horrific spectacles. On one side stands Basil II, Emperor of the Romans, whose reign would earn him the chilling epithet, the Bulgar Slayer. Born in 958 into the Macedonian dynasty, Basil was literally born in the purple, in the imperial chamber, marking him as legitimate from birth. Yet his childhood was far from sheltered. His father died early, leaving Basil to witness regents and generals struggle for power while he awaited his turn to rule. When he finally took real control in his 20s, he was shaped by those experiences. Basil became, by all accounts, one of the least ostentatious emperors imaginable. No extravagant banquets, no lavish court ceremonies unless necessary. He wore military garb more often than imperial purple. He never married, had no children, and reportedly lived almost monastically. Everything in his life revolved around the empire and its expansion. Chroniclers describe him as of medium height, piercing blue eyes, a thick beard, and an imposing presence that made even veteran generals uneasy. Methodical, patient, ruthlessly efficient when required, Basil held grudges as others held swords. John Skylitz's, Byzantine historian, notes that Basil never forgave injuries, a detail of immense significance later. Opposing him was Samuel of Bulgaria. His early life is murky, partly due to Byzantine propaganda designed to diminish him, yet the facts speak for themselves. Samuel rose to power in the 970s and 980s amid chaos in Bulgaria. Through sheer will and military brilliance, he stabilized the state and expanded it dramatically. His contemporaries called him invincible. Bulgarian sources describe him as a warrior king who led from the front, mastering both the grand strategy of empire building and the tactical intricacies of mountain warfare. Samuel understood a crucial truth. He could not defeat Byzantium in open battle. So he did not try. He leveraged terrain, employed guerrilla tactics, and forced Byzantines to bleed for every mile of land. For Basil, Samuel embodied everything he despised. A man asserting legitimate rule over what Basil considered Roman territory, defying the will of God's chosen emperor. In the summer of 986, Samuel made the conflict intensely personal. Basil II, still in his late 20s, confident and perhaps overconfident, had already suppressed internal revolts. Yet the simmering hatred between these two men, their personal stakes in a war that transcended politics, set the stage for one of the most extraordinary and horrifying events in medieval history. Basil had proven himself capable. Now he decided it was time to settle the Bulgarian problem once and for all. He gathered a massive army. Sources suggest roughly 30,000 men, though medieval figures are notoriously unreliable, and marched into Bulgaria. His target was the fortress of Serdica, present-day Sofia. A strategic linchpin, taking it would open the heart of the Bulgarian Empire. At first, the campaign appeared straightforward. The Byzantines had superior numbers, professional soldiers, and advanced equipment. Yet Samuel had anticipated this. After some inconclusive fighting near Serdica, Basil decided to withdraw for the winter. A tactical retreat seemed sensible: regroup, resupply, and return in the spring. But to return to Byzantine territory, his army had to traverse a narrow mountain pass, known as the Gates of Trajan, carved into the Shredna Gora Mountains. The terrain transformed the pass into a master, where numbers meant nothing. Samuel had been waiting. His forces occupied the high ground, perfectly positioned to strike. As the Byzantine army entered the confined valley, stringed out and exhausted from the march, Samuel struck. Byzantine sources downplayed the scale, but the reality was undeniable: a massacre. The Bulgarians rained down on the imperial column from the heights. Professional soldiers, well-trained and heavily armed, could not form coherent battle lines in the cramped space. Chaos reigned. Basil's bodyguard attempted to shield him, but the attack was relentless. According to chroniclers, Basil barely escaped with his life. Mounting a swift horse, he fled back to Constantinople. The Bulgarians seized not only weapons, armor, and supplies, but also something intangible: Basil's dignity. For an emperor who viewed himself as God's chosen ruler, entitled to dominion over all Christian lands, this was more than a military setback. It was a personal humiliation, a spiritual affront. To Byzantine emperors, defeat was cosmic, a disruption of divine order. Samuel had not merely won a battle. He had challenged the natural hierarchy of the universe itself. Basil would spend the next 28 years repaying that debt. The young, impetuous emperor transformed into something colder and more calculating. He did not immediately retaliate. Instead, he focused inward. Rebellious generals, emboldened by the humiliation, attempted to seize power. Basil crushed them systematically, learning patience and the power of careful planning. Bulgaria, however, remained his ultimate target. From the late 980s into the 990s, Basil embarked on a relentless campaign: the systematic destruction of the Bulgarian state. This was not a war of glorious battles. It was attrition, a grinding down of an entire nation. Every year, without fail, Basil marched into Bulgarian territory. Crops were burned, farmland destroyed, fortresses captured and razed. Then he withdrew. Next year, he returned. Methodical, unyielding, devastatingly effective. Byzantine historian John Skylitzes describes it plainly. Basil II continued to invade Bulgaria annually, destroying everything in his path. Imagine life on the ground. Every summer, the Byzantine army approached. Villagers abandoned fields, hid their food, hoped their local fortresses could hold. Even if the army bypassed a village, neighboring destruction meant scarcity the next winter. Samuel resisted fiercely. He was a brilliant defensive commander, making Basil pay dearly for every advance. In 998, he even invaded Byzantine lands, reaching Thessaloniki itself. Yet the math was unforgiving. Byzantium had more men, greater resources, and superior finances. Losses could be sustained, Bulgaria could not. By the early 1000s, the pattern became unavoidable. Fortresses that had stood for decades fell. Bulgarian nobles, recognizing the inevitable, began defecting to the Byzantines. The empire was slowly strangling Samuel's kingdom. Samuel, now an old man in his 60s, a remarkable age at the time, watched his lifetime of achievement crumble. Yet desperate men are dangerous. In 1014, as Basil prepared for another campaign, Samuel realized he needed a decisive stand. A drawn-out attrition war could not succeed. Perhaps one final victory could make Basil reconsider, could reverse the tide. He chose a location with perfect defensive advantages, a mountain valley called the Kleidion Pass. The Kleidion Pass, its Greek name meaning the key, was a narrow gorge nestled between the Belisitsa and Arashtan mountains. Geography dictated strategy. The pass was a choke point where Samuel's forces could neutralize Byzantine numbers and control the battlefield. Basil, confident in his experience and forces, marched deep into Bulgarian territory in July of 1014, unaware that the trap Samuel had meticulously prepared awaited him. The stage was set for one of the most infamous confrontations of the medieval era. Terrain, numbers, and strategy would combine to produce horror and spectacle, as Basil's professional army approached what would become a nightmare. Here, the mountains themselves became weapons, amplifying Samuel's cunning defensive positioning. He understood the value of patience, of attrition, of psychological warfare. He had learned from years of defending against an emperor with near-unlimited resources. Now he hoped that one tactical stroke could alter the trajectory of 3 decades of relentless campaigning. The approaching Byzantine army, fatigued from forced marches and confident in their numerical superiority, advanced into the gorge. Samuel's men, hidden and ready, observed every movement. The narrowness of the pass ensured that Basil's soldiers could not deploy effectively. Professional discipline and heavy armor, normally advantages, now became liabilities. Every step forward increased exposure. Every formation that tried to adjust was blocked by terrain or ambushed from above. The valley would decide the fate of thousands. Basil, who had survived Trajan's gates years earlier, now faced a similar challenge, though this time the stakes were higher. His patience, experience, and ruthlessness would all be tested against Samuel's cunning, knowledge of terrain, and sheer determination to protect what remained of his empire. The clash in Kleidion Pass would not merely be a battle. It would be a test of strategy, endurance, and the psychological fortitude of 2 men whose decades-long hatred had reshaped the Balkans. Samuel ordered his engineers to construct a massive fortification across the valley, a wall of earth and timber completely blocking the pass. Behind it, he positioned the best troops Bulgaria could muster, estimated between 12,000 and 15,000 men. The plan was simple. Basil could not bypass the mountains in any reasonable time frame. He would have to force the pass, and when he did, the Bulgarians would slaughter his army in the confined space. When Basil's forces arrived and saw the fortification, he must have recognized the scene. This was the very type of terrain advantage that Samuel had exploited decades earlier at the gates of Trajan. But Basil was no longer the same man. In his mid-50s and hardened by nearly 30 years of continuous warfare, he ordered his army to attack the fortification anyway. For days, accounts vary from 3 to 7, Byzantine troops launched frontal assaults on the Bulgarian wall. Each attack was repelled with heavy losses. The defenders fought with the desperation of men aware that this could be their final stand. Arrows, javelins, and boulders rained down on anyone who approached. Hot oil poured over the wall killed or maimed dozens at a time. The bodies of the dead piled in front of the fortification. Some of Basil's generals urged him to find another route, to abandon the attack. But Basil had something else in mind. He conferred with one of his most trusted commanders, Nikephoros Xiphias. Xiphias proposed a daring alternative. What if the army did not attempt the pass at all, but instead climbed over the Belisitsa mountains? The range was steep, rugged, and wild. No proper trails existed. The journey would exhaust men, horses, and equipment alike. If Samuel discovered the maneuver, the detachment would be annihilated. But if it succeeded, the Byzantine army would strike from an unexpected direction, turning the battlefield on its head. Basil approved. Xiphias led a detachment, likely a few thousand soldiers, through the trackless wilderness. For days, they navigated goat paths, dense forests, and steep cliffs, moving with full armor and weapons, staying quiet to avoid detection. Meanwhile, the main army continued its attacks at the front, keeping the Bulgarians focused on the wall. Then, on the morning of July 29th, everything came together. The Bulgarians, exhausted but confident after holding the pass for days, manned their positions as the Byzantines launched yet another frontal assault. And from behind, cutting through the morning air, came the sound that must have frozen every Bulgarian soldier. the war cries of Xiphia's detachment emerging from the mountains behind them. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. Bulgarian soldiers, who had fought and bled for days, now faced enemy forces appearing from a direction that was supposed to be secure. Panic spread. According to John Skylitzes, the Bulgarian defense collapsed almost immediately. Men abandoned their positions, attempting to flee. But the genius of Basil's strategy was cruelly precise. The massive wall that had been built to stop the Byzantines now trapped the Bulgarians between two armies, Xiphia's force behind them and Basil's main army in front. The carefully constructed defensive position became a killing ground. Samuel himself barely escaped, carried to safety by his son Gabriel, who fought off Byzantine soldiers long enough to mount him on a horse. Behind them, the Bulgarian army was systematically destroyed. Thousands were cut down in the chaos. Thousands more were captured alive. Estimates suggest as many as 15,000 men. They were disarmed, stripped of their armor, and herded together under close guard. The battle was over. Basil had achieved total victory. But for the prisoners, the true horror was about to begin. Basil remembered Trajan's Gate and the decades of humiliation he had endured at Samuel's hands. Standing on that battlefield, he planned a punishment so meticulously cruel that it would echo through history. The options available to Basil were many. He could have ransomed the prisoners, bringing wealth into the imperial treasury. He could have executed them swiftly, as was standard in medieval warfare. He could have enslaved them, pressed them into service, or held them as hostages. But Basil chose none of these conventional options. Instead, he gave an order that must have seemed incomprehensible, a systematic act of cruelty designed to terrorize for generations. According to John Skylitzes, the prisoners, approximately 15,000 men, were divided into groups of 100. Within each group, 99 men were to be blinded. This was not a clean or surgical procedure. While the exact methods remain uncertain, it likely involved heated irons or sharp instruments pressed into the eyes. Some accounts suggest the use of daggers to pierce eyeballs. Others mention cauterization. The result was agonizing and permanent. The men would never see again, left completely dependent on others for survival, unable to work, fight, or reclaim their former lives. Each man became a living testament to the totality of Basil's vengeance. The 100th man in each group was deliberately spared one eye. One eye, just enough to guide the 99 blinded men home. This was not an act of mercy. It was the opposite, a deliberate amplification of suffering. Basil ensured that the message of Byzantine vengeance would reach Samuel, the Bulgarian people, and the wider world in the most visceral, unforgettable way. These surviving soldiers, leading their blinded comrades across the lands they once defended, embodied both the totality of defeat and the psychological mastery of Basil II. The genius of the act lay in its cruelty and symbolism. It was a punishment that communicated far more than death could. Death creates martyrs, heroes to rally around. Survival, stripped of dignity and power, creates despair, fear, and a lesson carved into memory. Basil understood that the ultimate message of war was not merely to kill enemies, but to transform them into living evidence of the futility of defiance. By sparing the 100th man in each group, he ensured that the horror would be witnessed, remembered, and carried home as a story of complete domination. In one stroke, Basil II had not only destroyed Bulgaria's army, but also shattered its morale, its leadership, and its capacity to resist for decades. Samuel's empire, painstakingly built over decades, was irreversibly weakened, and the psychological impact extended far beyond the battlefield. The image of 15,000 men blinded, forced to march under the guidance of a single-sighted comrade, became a warning to all future generations. Resistance to Byzantine power could be met with a vengeance more horrifying than death itself. These partially sighted men were given a chilling new purpose: to guide their completely blinded comrades back to Tsar Samuel. Modern historians debate the numbers. 15,000 seems exaggerated, and the neat ratio of 99 blinded men to one partially sighted guide is almost certainly symbolic. Medieval chroniclers loved round, theologically satisfying figures. But while the exact numbers may be inflated, the core reality is undeniable. A mass blinding occurred on a scale unprecedented in medieval warfare. Consider the logistics. This was not an impulsive act during battle. It required days of careful organization. Orders had to be issued, prisoners processed in groups, and Byzantine soldiers had to carry out the systematic mutilation. All the while, screams, pleas, and cries of terror echoed through the ranks. Men in the back watched what happened to those in front, fully aware their turn was coming. The psychological torment was as intense as the physical. What about the soldiers executing the orders? Some may have considered it merely duty. Others had been fighting these same men for years and may have felt justified brutality. But surely, some must have questioned the morality of it, confronted by the staggering human cost unfolding before them. Basil was not finished. Once the blinding was complete, he issued one final order to the surviving soldiers, the one-eyed guides: return home. Deliver a message to their king. Show him what happens to those who resist the Byzantine Empire. And so began one of the most horrifying marches in human history. Picture it. Thousands of men stumbling through medieval terrain blind, their faces smeared with blood and fluid from their destroyed eyes. Many were suffering infections, eye wounds were prone to sepsis in this era, and some were dying as they walked. Pain was constant, merciless, inescapable. Each group of 99 blind men was led by a single partially sighted comrade, able to see just enough to steer them forward, fully aware of the horror surrounding him. The march took weeks. The distance from the battlefield to Samuel's camp was substantial, and movement was slow. The men had to beg for food and shelter along the way. Local villagers witnessed the endless column, a grotesque parade of suffering. The news spread ahead. The Bulgarian army is returning, but you won't believe what was done to them. When the procession finally reached Tsar Samuel in late summer, the old king awaited news from the battlefield. He knew there had been engagement, but could not fathom the magnitude of the disaster. Chroniclers unanimously report his reaction. He was destroyed by what he saw. John Skylitzes writes that Samuel fainted upon seeing his soldiers, reduced to walking, mutilated shadows of their former selves, stumbling toward him. Imagine the moment. An elderly ruler, who had spent his life building and defending an empire, confronted with the living embodiment of his failure. Thousands of men, once trained warriors, reduced to living monuments of horror. Chroniclers suggest Samuel never recovered from the shock. Within 2 days, on October 6, 1014, he died, likely of a stroke or heart attack. The psychological and physical strain had killed him. The symbolism was perfect. Basil's weapon, psychological as much as physical, had achieved its goal. He had destroyed not just an army, but the spirit of an emperor. This act earned Basil his terrifying epithet, Basil Bulgarochtonos, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. Samuel's death marked the beginning of the end. Within 4 years, Bulgaria was fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Basil had achieved his objective. The empire that humiliated him 30 years prior was erased. The blinding of the Bulgarian army remains one of history's most chilling examples of psychological warfare. In the Byzantine world, blinding was already a recognized political tool. A physically impaired man could not claim the throne. Basil, however, weaponized this practice on an industrial scale, transforming it into mass terror. He demonstrated that Byzantine power was not solely military. It was psychological. They could inflict fates worse than death. They could break armies and spirits alike. The blinded soldiers became living testaments to Byzantine dominance and imperial vengeance. So, consider the ethical question. Was Basil II a monstrous tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds? Or was he a strategic genius, fully aware that terror could be more effective than slaughter? The blinding concluded a war spanning 50 years. In Basil's mind, perhaps 15,000 men rendered permanently blind were preferable to decades more of bloodshed. But for the men themselves, for those forced to spend the rest of their lives in darkness, the calculation was very different. They became the human cost of imperial ambition, a walking message that defiance against Byzantine authority was futile. This is what happens when personal vendetta meets military might and political calculation. Physical destruction alone is not always sufficient. The most effective weapon is often psychological, designed to break morale, to terrify, to impress obedience through horror rather than mere death. Basil's campaign illustrates this principle vividly. The question remains, was this atrocity unforgivable? Or was it the brutal, strategic conclusion to decades of war? 15,000 blinded men, marching back to their king, reshaped the political landscape of the Balkans for generations. It sent a message to allies, enemies, and subjects alike. The Byzantine Empire would tolerate no defiance. Resistance was not merely defeated, it was immortalized as a cautionary spectacle. The cruelty of the act ensured its place in history. Stories of the blinding and the resulting psychological devastation became warnings, passed down by chroniclers and later historians. Basil's power was measured not only in conquered territory, but in the minds of those who survived. These soldiers, returning with their permanent disability, became living symbols of total subjugation and the terrifying reach of Byzantine authority. It is worth noting the broader lesson. Military might alone does not always secure an empire. Psychological dominance, the ability to instill lasting fear, can accomplish what conventional warfare cannot. Basil II's victory demonstrates how a ruler can combine strategy, patience, and calculated cruelty to achieve both tactical and psychological supremacy. The blinding of the Bulgarian army was not merely punishment. It was the ultimate demonstration of power, designed to leave no question in the minds of allies or enemies. Defiance carried consequences far beyond death. In the end, Basil II's actions were simultaneously monstrous and effective. The mass blinding solved the decades-long Bulgarian problem decisively, ending resistance and absorbing the territory into the Byzantine Empire. Yet it also left a legacy of horror, immortalized in chronicles as one of the most extreme acts of psychological warfare ever recorded. The lessons of Kleidion pass, the gates of Trajan, and the blinding endure. Empires are not only built with armies but with fear, symbolism, and the calculated manipulation of human psychology. So, how should we judge Basil II? As a tyrant, a sadist, or a brilliant strategist? The answer depends on perspective. For the empire, he achieved security, power, and compliance. For the victims, the consequences were permanent and unimaginable. For history, it remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapons are not swords, arrows, or catapults, but terror wielded with unflinching precision.